I knew something was off the moment my assistant didn't meet my eyes when I walked past her desk that Tuesday morning. Wendy had worked 3 cubicles down from me for 11 years. She always had a coffee comment ready, something about the Tim Hortons line-up downstairs or how the double machine on the 4th floor was broken again. That morning, she just stared at her monitor like it held the answer to something deeply personal. I filed it away and kept walking. My name is Roger. I was 51 years old, and I had spent 27 years building industrial procurement systems for one of the largest aerospace component manufacturers in southern Ontario. We supplied to everyone: Bombardier, Pratt & Whitney Canada, Bell Helicopter, the kind of company where your badge number told people exactly how long you'd been around, and mine was 4 digits long at a time when most new hires were getting 6. I wasn't the flashiest guy in the room. I didn't play golf with the executives or show up to the holiday party with a bottle of Peller Estates and a story about my cottage in Muskoka. What I did was work. I built procurement frameworks that saved the company somewhere north of $40 million over a decade. I knew where every supply bottleneck lived, what our exposure was on any given quarter, and exactly which vendors would fold under pressure and which ones would hold. That knowledge lived in my head as much as it lived in any system, and the people who ran this company knew it. 3 years before any of this happened, the board brought in a new VP of operations. His name was Stuart. Mid-40s, MBA from Queen's, very comfortable in a conference room, very uncomfortable with anyone who pushed back on his projections. He came in with what he called a modernization mandate, which in practice meant he wanted to replace institutional knowledge with dashboards and replace people who cost a lot with people who cost lot. I watched him work through the department above me, then the one beside me, then he started circling. My compensation by that point was not modest. 27 years of annual reviews, a handful of performance bonuses, and a long service increment structure meant I was earning comfortably into the 6 figures. For a company in a belt-tightening cycle, I understood how that looked on a spreadsheet. I just didn't think they'd be stupid enough to do what they eventually did. Here's the part you need to understand about my contract, because everything that follows depends on it. 4 years earlier, when the company had been trying to keep me from taking a competing offer out of Mississauga, the then VP of Operations had agreed to include a retention bonus in my renegotiated contract. The structure was this: a lump sum bonus of $280,000 would vest on the 1st of December in my 28th year of service. The clause tied to it was written by their own legal team. I remember reading it at my kitchen table in Kitchener with my reading glasses on. And I remember the exact line. It said that if the company terminated the employee's position for any reason other than cause within 90 days prior to the scheduled vesting date, the company would be liable for twice the vesting amount, plus reasonable damages as determined through arbitration. Twice the amount. I had a good labor lawyer in Waterloo read it before I signed. She looked up from the paper and said, "Roger, whoever wrote this for them wasn't paying attention." I asked her if it was enforceable. She said she'd stake her practice on it. I signed. I put the contract in my filing cabinet at home, behind my insurance documents and my kids' birth certificates. And then I went back to work and largely forgot about it, the way you forget about a fire extinguisher. It's there. You hope you never need it, but you checked the gauge before you mounted it on the wall. The vesting date was December 1st. They called me into a meeting on November 3rd. Stuart's assistant had sent the calendar invite at 4:30 the previous afternoon, which I noticed only when I was shutting down for the day. No subject line. Just my name, Stuart's name, and the name of the HR director. A woman named Connie, who had been with the company about 18 months and who I'd never once seen deliver good news to anyone. When I saw those 3 names together in a calendar invite with no subject, I knew. I went home that evening, opened the filing cabinet, took out my contract, and read the relevant clause 3 times. Then I called my lawyer. It was almost 6 o'clock, but she picked up. I read her the clause again and told her the situation. She said, "Don't say anything you don't have to say. Take notes, and call me as soon as you're out of that room." I slept fine that night, which surprises people when I tell them. My wife thought I was in denial. I wasn't. I just knew what I was holding. The meeting was at 10 in the morning in a boardroom on the 6th floor. Stuart sat at the head of the table in the kind of posture that people adopt when they've rehearsed what they're about to say. Connie sat to his left with a folder and a pen, and the particular expression of someone who has been professionally trained not to feel things. There was a third person I didn't recognize, a man in his early 40s who I later learned was from an outside HR consulting firm they had apparently brought in to manage the transition communications. That's the phrase he used. Transition communications. Stuart opened by thanking me for my years of service, which is the sentence that tells you it's over before the next one arrives. Then he told me that as part of a structural realignment of the operations division, my position was being eliminated, effective immediately. I said, "What's the timeline on this realignment?" He said they'd been working on it for several months. I said, "And when did the board approve it?" He looked at Connie. She said it had been approved at the October board meeting. I said, "I assume the documentation for that is available for review." Stuart said it wasn't standard practice to share board minutes with departing employees. I wrote that down. I asked about my notice period. Connie slid a document across the table. They were offering 8 weeks working notice plus a severance package calculated at 1 week per year of service, which works out to 27 weeks. Combined, that's 35 weeks of pay. In Ontario, under the Employment Standards Act, they were more or less at the legal minimum for someone at my tenure, with a small cushion probably added on advice of counsel to avoid an easy wrongful dismissal claim. They had done this before. They knew the numbers. What they apparently did not know, or had forgotten, or had never bothered to check, was what was sitting in my employment contract in a filing cabinet in Kitchener. I looked at the severance sheet for a moment, then I looked at Stuart. I said, "I want to make sure I understand the effective date. You're saying my employment ends immediately." He said yes. Given the nature of the realignment, they felt it was cleaner to have me transition out of the building today rather than work the notice period, and they would pay the 8 weeks in lieu. I said, "So I won't be here on December 1st. He said that was correct. I said, "Okay." I signed the acknowledgement that I had received the termination notice. I did not sign the severance release. I told Connie I would need time to review it with my legal counsel, which is absolutely your right under Ontario law, and which she could not legally pressure me to waive. She said, of course, they'd give me until the end of the following week. I said that might not be enough time. She said they could extend to 3 weeks. I said I'd be in touch. I shook Stuart's hand. I thanked the consultant for coming in. I walked back to my desk, called Wendy over, told her it had been a privilege working with her, and asked her to give my regards to the team. Then I packed my personal items into a box that Connie had already placed on my chair. That detail still gets me, the box placed there in advance. And I took the elevator down to the lobby and walked out into a cold November afternoon in Ontario. I called my lawyer from the parking lot. She said, "Tell me everything." I told her everything. There was a pause on her end. Then she said, "Roger, they terminated you 28 days before vesting." I said I was aware. She said, "Get in your car. Drive home. Don't talk to anyone from that company until you hear from me." I drove home. My wife was in the kitchen when I walked in carrying a box of desk things at 2 in the afternoon. She took one look at my face and said, "What happened?" I put the box on the counter and told her. When I got to the part about the contract clause, she sat down. The next morning, my lawyer sent a letter to the company's legal department. I didn't see the full text of it, but she described it to me in brief. It referenced the retention bonus clause, stated the precise vesting date, calculated the liability as twice the vesting amount, that being $560,000, plus damages, and invited the company to respond within 10 business days before she filed for arbitration. I want to be precise here because this matters. The original bonus was $280,000. Double that is $560,000. My lawyer also flagged additional heads of damages, including bad faith conduct in the manner of termination, which under Ontario employment law can attract further compensation beyond the contractual amount. We were looking at a potential total exposure for them somewhere between $650,000 and $750,000, depending on how an arbitrator valued the damages component. Not a cent of that was my math. That was my lawyer's math, and she triple-checked it before sending. The response from their legal team came in 9 days. I wasn't privy to the internal conversations that happened on their side, but my lawyer told me afterward that the outside counsel they retained apparently went back and looked at the original contract and then called Stuart's assistant to confirm the termination date, and that it was after that call that the situation escalated to the level of the company's executive team. I like to imagine that conversation. I try not to take too much satisfaction in it. I mostly fail. Their initial response was to dispute the applicability of the clause. They argued that the realignments constituted a structural change rather than a direct termination of my employment, and that under that interpretation the clause should not be triggered. My lawyer said she'd seen worse arguments made with a straight face, and that they were welcome to advance it at arbitration, where she felt confident about the outcome. She also noted that the letter itself, by engaging with the clause at all, was an implicit acknowledgement that the clause existed and applied in principle. There was a second round of correspondence. Then a call between counsel. Then a request for a mediated settlement discussion. We sat down 3 weeks later at a mediator's office in downtown Kitchener. Stuart was not in the room. The company was represented by their outside counsel, a sharp woman in her early 50s who, I suspect, privately agreed with our position and was there to manage the damage. My lawyer sat beside me. The mediator sat at the head of the table. I sat and said almost nothing for 4 hours while the two lawyers and the mediator worked through it. The company's position had shifted. They were no longer contesting the clause. They were contesting the damages calculation. Their counsel argued that reasonable damages should be interpreted narrowly and that the bad faith component didn't meet the threshold established in a 2008 Ontario Superior Court case she cited by name. My lawyer disagreed and cited 3 other cases. This went on for most of the morning. After lunch, the company's counsel made an offer. It was $420,000. Not the $560,000 in contract liability alone, and nowhere near the upper end of the damages range. My lawyer looked at me. I said no. She communicated that to the other side. There was a recess. About 40 minutes. When we came back, the number was $580,000. My lawyer leaned over and said quietly that this was above the base contractual amount and represented a reasonable damages premium, given the litigation risk on both sides. She said we could push further, but noted that arbitration would take another 8 to 14 months, and that the outcome on the bad faith component was genuinely uncertain under current case law. I thought about it. I thought about spending the better part of a year in a legal process. I thought about my wife, who had gone quiet in a particular way in the weeks after I'd been let go. Not angry, just watchful. A little careful with me in the way spouses are when they're worried. I thought about the fact that $580,000 was $580,000. I said yes. The settlement included a confidentiality provision which is standard in these matters, so I'm not attaching names to anything specific here. What I can tell you is that I walked out of that mediation with a signed agreement and a timeline for payment, and that the funds arrived in my account 6 weeks later. I didn't go back into corporate procurement after that. I took 3 months off, which felt luxurious and strange in equal measure. I consulted for a while, mostly smaller manufacturers who couldn't afford a full-time procurement director but needed someone who knew the landscape. I work about 20 hours a week now. My wife and I spent 2 weeks in Nova Scotia last summer. It was the longest stretch of time I'd taken away from work since my honeymoon. Stuart left the company 14 months after my termination. I heard through someone in the industry that the operations realignment had not delivered the savings the board had projected, and that 2 of the major supplier relationships I had managed went sideways in the first year after I left. Whether those things are connected to his departure, I genuinely don't know. I'm not interested in constructing a narrative where the universe balanced the ledger. Maybe it did. Maybe it's coincidence. What I do know is this. When I was 24 years old and signing my first employment contract at that company, I read every page. My father, who had worked the line at an auto parts plant in Cambridge for 31 years and been laid off twice without $1 beyond the legal minimum, told me before I started, read everything, understand everything, and if you don't understand it, pay someone who does. I paid attention to that. I kept paying attention to it even when the contracts got longer and the language got denser and it would have been easier to just sign and move on. The clause that saved me wasn't something I inserted through some brilliant strategy. Their own legal team wrote it in their own contract to induce me to stay. They just forgot it was there. Or they assumed I wouldn't notice. Or they assumed that someone who spent 27 years in procurement wouldn't bother reading a document carefully before acting on it. That's the part I find most instructive. Not the money, not the outcome, not any of it. Just the quiet assumption that the person across the table from you hasn't done their homework. I had done my homework. I always do. I still think about that box sometimes. The one Connie had placed on my chair before I even walked into the room. Whoever carried it there set it down, smoothed the cardboard flaps. They did it assuming I would leave quietly, the way people do when they've already decided someone doesn't matter enough to surprise them. That detail used to bother me. Now I think it's the most honest part of the whole story. What happened to me wasn't unusual. Companies make calculations about people the same way they make calculations about equipment. When the cost of keeping something exceeds the perceived return, they move to replace it. I understood that at 51. I don't hold a grudge against the logic of it. What I do hold accountable is the carelessness, the assumption that someone who had spent 27 years paying attention would somehow stop paying attention right at the end. That's not how integrity works. And I mean that in the plainest sense of the word. Not as a virtue you perform for other people, but as a kind of structural wholeness. You either read the documents or you don't. You either keep your records or you let them slip. You either do the work of understanding what you've agreed to, or you find out later that the terms were never in your favor to begin with. I read, I kept records, I understood. Not because I was expecting to be betrayed, but because my father taught me that the world doesn't give you credit for things you almost did. The settlement didn't fall into my lap. It was the result of 27 years of showing up, 3 decades of reading carefully, and one very good lawyer, who I had the wisdom to call before I signed anything I didn't have to sign. People hear the number and think luck. It wasn't luck. It was preparation, meeting a moment that was always going to come eventually, in one form or another. Because the way Stuart ran that department, it was only ever a matter of time before someone with tenure became a line item problem. What I want people to take from this, especially anyone earlier in their career than I was, is that knowledge is not the same as intelligence, and intelligence is not the same as perseverance. You can be smart enough to understand a contract and still never read one carefully. You can read carefully once and then stop. The thing that actually protects you is the habit of taking your responsibilities seriously, even when no one is watching, even when the stakes seem low, even when it would be easier to just initial and move on. That habit, sustained over years, is what turns a piece of paper in a filing cabinet into $580,000 in your account. I don't think Stuart was a bad person. I think he was a person in a hurry who stopped checking his assumptions. In the end, that cost his company far more than my salary ever did. That's not justice in any grand sense. It's just cause and effect, doing what cause and effect always does, when you give it enough time. I'm working 20 hours a week now. Last summer, my wife and I drove the Cabot Trail. We took our time. That's the thing about doing the work properly, you tend to end up with more of it.